Joining us, the co-director of Make It 16, Sanat Singh. Good evening, sir. Thank you for joining us today.
Kia ora. Thanks for having me on.
Kia ora. Yeah, hey, listen, big news in the world of Make It 16. Perhaps you'd like to just explain to the audience exactly who you guys as an organization are and
Sure.
what you are striving to achieve. Why don't you let us know all about it while I show people the news story from today?
Cool as. So we're a nonpartisan advocacy group that started in 2019 who's trying to lower the voting age for all elections in Aotearoa, New Zealand. So we started in 2019. We came from Youth Parliament and we launched a challenge in the High Court on the basis that the Bill of Rights Act says that 16 and 17-year-olds should be free from age discrimination, and a voting age of 18 is therefore discriminatory towards 16 and 17-year-olds. That challenge in the High Court failed initially, and then we took it to the Court of Appeals in 2021, and they came back to us and said that it was unjustified age discrimination, so there was no justification to keep 16 and 17-year-olds from voting, but when they stopped right at the point where we wanted, which was a declaration of inconsistency, which would have basically given a very clear moral and legal message to Parliament to say, look, this is a clear abuse of rights, so you have to do something to amend the law to make sure that those rights aren't abused.
Yep.
And then we took it to the Supreme Court, and today our court result, the result of our hearing came out this morning, and we got the result that, look, it's inconsistent. There is a rights abuse, and Parliament has to do something about it. So it's a really fantastic.
It's a pretty momentous day. There's a couple of things to talk through.
Yeah.
16 and 17-year-olds should be free from age discrimination. That's the first thing that I like to talk through. And also the idea of unjustified age discrimination, obviously meaning that you can have a justifiable age discrimination.
Yeah.
I don't know. Let's say you're in the under 12s cricket team. Then justifiable discrimination would be not allowing 15-year-olds to play in it. And I'm assuming in the law that would be justified. If you receive the pension at 65, then it's justified discrimination against 45-year-olds who can't get it. So there is discrimination out there based on age, but they're saying this is unjustified age discrimination. I guess what I wanted, I'll read this part of the story off Stuff that gave us all the headlines. It says the Supreme Court has strengthened the claim for a change to the voting age with a declaration that the current age of 18 is unjustified discrimination, as you just said. On Monday today, the court decided the current voting age is unjustified discrimination on the basis of age under the Bill of Rights Act, but only Parliament can change the voting age. However, lobby group Make It 16, welcome, says a declaration of the voting age breaches the Bill of Rights Act would send politicians a strong moral message for change. One of my, I guess, ponderances around this in general is if it's unjustified age discrimination to 16 and 17-year-olds, why isn't it unjustified age discrimination to 14 and 15-year-olds?
That's a really good question. And the provision that's set out in the Bill of Rights is the basis of our case. And that provision is that it's everyone that's 16 and above that is free from age discrimination. So but
why 16? I guess. I mean, because look, I read through. Look, I'm finding this a really fascinating idea because I've got your website here as well that's going up, and it says the 5 reasons to make it 16. At 18, you already can make important life decisions. There shouldn't be taxation without representation. Many other countries preventing 16, 17-year-olds from voting is unjustified age discrimination, breach of a Bill of Rights. Voting is a fundamental right. Every voice deserves to be heard in a democracy. Now, most of these could apply to a 14 or 15-year-old. Now, not all of them, because you do say you have important responsibilities like driving, medical procedures, consent, leave school, leave home, pay rent, own a firearm. There's probably a couple in there that if you're 15, you can't have. But most of them, bar a couple of things, a 14 and a 15-year-old could make this exact same argument. Now, I'm not suggesting you shouldn't have drawn a line in the sand, but you have by making it 16 and not say 14, because like my kids had paper runs at 12, 13, 14. So there's taxation without representation. Voting is a fundamental right. Every voice deserves to be heard. That's a 14 and a 15-year-old. So yeah, what was the I guess what's the legal rationale, and I guess why your decision to stop it at 16?
Yeah, I guess there's a couple of ways to look at it, right? We couldn't have launched a court case without drawing a line in the sand, and that line in the
Sure.
sand was what was legally legally supplied to us in the Bill of Rights Act, and that was 16 and 17-year-olds. But you make a really good case here about other ages, and I'll draw the context to countries like Canada, which also have litigation efforts happening over there. In Canada's equivalent Bill of Rights, there is no like minimum age to be free from age discrimination. So
Hmm.
there, they have youth litigants that are as old as 12 and 13 arguing for this right to vote. Over here, that was just simply legally impossible because we wouldn't have been able to. But I also think if we think about it politically and also a little bit tangibly, right, the life experiences a 16, 17-year-old shares with maybe an 18-year-old is really closely correlated. And also, it's probably a reasonable thing to say politically when we have examples overseas of other countries lowering it to 16 first. So that's sort of the rationale that we use to develop an argument for 16 and 17-year-olds. That is to say, there are academics out there who argue for things like universal suffrage. We've had quite a few conversations with them where they say, look, any restriction that is applied to a group of people in a democratic society is unjustified, absolutely. As a movement, we don't agree with that because we are Make It 16. We have
Hmm.
political viability and legal viability to draw the line at 16. But yeah, there's certainly conversations about lowering the voting age even further. As a group, we're not advocating for that though.
I
Because
I think
oh,
that
sorry.
I mean, like from where I sit politically, which is definitely on the left, right?
Mhm.
I can see this as being an advantageous because I would think a higher proportion of people who are 16 and 17 would swing left than right. So actually, as a voting bloc, I kind of think this would probably be quite useful as a voting bloc if you are
Yeah.
a left-leaning person like me. However, I'm also someone who can walk and chew gum at the same time and kind of go, that if the court ruled that 16 and 17-year-olds should be free from age discrimination, then therefore why can't 16-year-olds drink? There's a line in the sand that the government's drawn, and it's not the same thing. So what I'm trying to do, whilst kind of going, I may see an advantage in this because my political ideologies might be more likely to get to the front. I'm also going, what's the logic behind this? And why is the logic say 16, 17 and not 14, 15? Or why does the logic say free from age discrimination to vote, but not to drink? So I'm trying to just, maybe I'm taking half a step backwards and looking at it from a little bit further away, as opposed to specifically what's happened today, specifically around voting, because what's going to happen to you guys, and I just put out a tweet that said, I hope you guys don't go on News Talk ZB this afternoon, because last time a teenage activist went on there in the form of Izzy Cook, she got
Yeah.
abused and heckled
Yeah.
and got trolled by the alt-right all over America. So I really hope you guys don't go on there, or by the time we play this out, haven't gone on there, because they're not good faith actors. But the truth is, people will be out there now looking to drive holes through this argument. And I guess,
Mm.
well, I'm not trying to do that from a what a bunch of dicks kind of point of view. I'm kind of going, I can see people are going to ask these questions, so I
Yeah.
kind of want to know. I almost kind of want to give you the weapons you need today to
For
go
sure.
when
Yeah.
these questions come, and I'm sure you've had them already. How do you
Yeah.
respond to why not a 14-year-old voting, why not a 16-year-old drinking? Because that's all age discrimination still.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, look, this is the reason I love the podcast format. It really lets us dive into these a lot more deeply
Yeah.
than a 5-minute interview over a phone call. And yeah, News Talk ZB has a lot of bad faith arguments. A lot of the opposition we face is bad faith. So yeah, I mean, there's a couple of things to dissect there, right? In terms of the left swing, I think the reason there, like, the reason there could be made a case for a left swing is because the issues that you know the left bloc prioritizes is almost always fighting for minority rights, fighting for things like
Totally.
climate change, right? So in that, you just have like an intrinsic property of the left being able to appeal to young people more. But in saying that, I also don't know anyone who, or at least in my age group, who vote like I don't know people who wouldn't vote for national unless their parents voted for national, right? So there's still
Yeah.
very much that cultural and social politicking that happens regardless of whether or not a group is a bloc. And saying that, right, young people are just a reflection of wider society. So all of those political reflections are still very much there, and those entrenched thoughts are very much there. So I wouldn't say it would be an incredibly significant left swing, even if we look at even if we look at it numerically. But I also think the reason so many parties on the right tend to come out with vitriol opposition is because they're almost afraid that they now have to appeal to a new voter base,
Sure.
or they have to be accountable to a new voter base. And
Well, it's I think it's the other side of the same coin. It's not that
yeah,
they're scared that they have to appeal to another voter base. It's that they realize that other voter base will go elsewhere. It's sort of the same
yes,
thing, but they're looking at it from the other side.
they're looking at exactly. They're
Yeah.
looking at it from the other side. And what I say here is like, come on, guys, we can't oppose something because we disagree with it, right? We can't stop someone from expressing their view simply because it's a view that we don't agree with. That's like, it's just a fundamental part of democracy that people are going to vote differently from you. But I also hope it's a bit of a wake up call to those parties to say, look, the closer we get to this reality, the closer you're going to have to start considering that young people want ideas. They want people advocating for them. They want
Sure.
someone that stands up for them. And if you're not going to do that, you're going to suffer political losses. And that's exactly why we say that voting for a 16, 17-year-old would make such a difference, is because every vote is an accountability measure. If you're not advocating or if you're not acting in good faith for the communities that you're seeking to represent, then you're not going to get voted back in. It's as simple as that. So that's sort of on that sort of left-right divide and swing over there. In terms of other ages, uh, I see where the whole 14 and 15-year-old thing comes in. I really do. And what I say to it is, if we have a voting age of 16 and 17, 14 and 15-year-olds, and for that matter, 12 to 13-year-olds, are going to be much more engaged in politics and civics education than they would be currently, which I think is probably a good step in the right direction to making a population that's super democratically engaged. In terms of, you know, other things that we discriminate 16 and 17-year-olds from doing, right? Like, let's say, buying alcohol or something.
Sure.
It's an interesting thing, right? Where the High Court initially we failed because they said that, look, it is age discrimination, but it is justified age discrimination. That's
For sure.
the judgment they came up with. And so the sort of learning we take away from that is every legal age that we set out is done or should be done on a case by case basis. The logic we might apply for, let's say, the reason we have a youth justice system rather than prosecuting 16 and 17-year-olds the same way we would, an adult offender, is because we believe that there is a better chance for rehabilitation, right? But then a separate case on a completely different basis can be made for voting, where it's like, look, these 16 and 17-year-olds are very much affected by the decisions that you're making,
Yep.
and are capable enough of, and the science back this, to make that decision. So we think it's reasonable to then give them the right to vote. So in that sort of lens, yeah, a lot of conversations should be happening about whether things are justified or whether they're not justified. But I think, no one else is advocating for the age to drink to be lowered, whereas people are advocating for the age of voting to be 16. So clearly,
So
right?
what I hear you saying is that the reason that you only fought for 16 and 17-year-olds is because you guys decided to fight for 16 and 17-year-olds. That was the line you just chose to draw in the sand, and that's what you're going for. So that's what you're going for. And any other questions around any other sort of age discrimination should be investigated of their own for someone who wants to investigate that of their own. So it's not necessarily that what we're saying is no one's used the word hypocritical, but you know what I mean. But that there seems to be a juxtaposition. Is that for today, the reason that you drew the line at 16 and 17 is because you drew the line at 16 and 17, and that's it.
Yeah, I mean,
Yeah.
Look, if there's a legal basis to make that argument, then that's the legal basis we're going to take. But also, like every sort of restriction we apply to any age group or demographic should be evaluated on a case by case basis to see whether it stands up to the test of time, whether it's appropriate for the society that we live in. And voting is something that has to be evaluated because the
Yeah.
challenges that we as a society face change over time. But the consumption of alcohol might be something that remains constant because of just like incredibly entrenched cultural feelings about the way we treat alcohol in this country. And that is also perfectly fine. So I don't think as a movement we have to come out and say we have a position on A, B, C. But I think as a movement, we can come out and say that, look, at the very least, if we're making decisions about young people and the things that they're doing, we should have them at the decision-making table.
Yeah, and look, I think that's all absolutely spot on. Completely, you want to hear from the voice of people who are being affected by legislation. I'll tell you what I think I'll tell you what I think one of the issues is, not with what you guys are doing, but with the conversation being confusing for some. And I remember when I was at university, the drinking age was 20. Yeah, and it got lowered to 18 while I was at university, and it was always very confusing because you could vote at 18, you could drink at 20. The university considered you an adult, i.e., for student allowance and stuff when you were 25, and there was a whole bunch of mixed messages as to when you're an adult. I think that, and I think that possibly the way around any of these conversations, should there be a pushback, is, well, let's decide when people are responsible for those adult decisions. And I think voting is an adult decision. It's something that is a responsibility of a well-functioning democracy, and let's apply all of the things to that age. Now that means, for example, there's for families and stuff, there's tax credits and stuff for kids at the moment. If we decided that age was going to be 17, then those tax credits would have to stop at 17, not 18, because that means we're making them everyone. That's the point of being an adult at that age. And I think one of the, not the problems, but one of the, I've said juxtaposition twice, but one of the things with this is 16 feels like a child in most areas of life. Voting feels like an adult interaction. And there's a mixed message there, at least for me. There will be a mixed message for many, unless we decide that at 16, that's actually when you're an adult. Now, that also means things like no more youth justice after 16. If you're an adult enough to vote, then you're adult enough in the eyes of the court. Maybe drinking. I'm not advocating for that at 16. If we figured out as a society and perhaps legislatively when someone was an adult, then probably all these questions would go away.
Yeah, you're probably right. It makes our job infinitely harder, though. I look, it's an interesting case, and we obviously this is something we have to deal with at the moment, right? This is a conversation we have to have. It's a funny thing. The age of majority legally in New Zealand is defined as 20, not 18. So there are mixed messages. I think the other angle you could potentially take here is to break away from the idea that voting is an inherently adult decision.
For sure.
And I think that's the push that we're trying to make here. That look, it's not about whether it's an adult decision or not. It's not tied. Like it's almost like the ideal voter is someone who is informed, someone who has access to quality information, someone who's able to independently make a decision, someone who's able to take feedback from the people around them and make their own opinions about what's happening. And sort of none of those things really can be universally applied to any age group, right? Otherwise,
no, for sure. Yeah, no, I agree.
And because otherwise we'd start bringing in things like a maximum voting age, right? Or we'd start looking at cognitive tests to determine whether someone should vote, right?
Or you'd have to do a test on how much you know about the electorate before you vote, because you might be 35, but literally have never seen, heard, spoken about what the ramifications of your vote are. So no, I agree with you. Just because you're 16 doesn't mean you're any more or less informed than someone who's 25.
Exactly. So, and look, let's be real here. If there was a 7-year-old genius, right, who knew everything and anything about the world, they could probably make a better decision about some things than me or another adult, right? Um,
I
so
guess what we do though is in society we go, because we can't look at the 7-year-old genius or the 5% to 15 year
yeah,
olds
so
who are
we have
well
to
informed.
make
We
we have
look
to
at what the trends say, and do
yeah
the
what
trends
proof
say that
is
20-year-olds are better informed than 16-year-olds when it comes to voting?
yeah
Because let's be honest, and I don't mean to be patronizing to anyone who's 16. You kind of you don't need to worry about too much in the world when you're 16 for your own personal survival. Typically most
for
16 year
sure
olds have a parent or parent. They get looked after, their bills get paid, their food gets paid. Yet a 20-year-old, either working or at university, has a different perspective on the world and to where their
yeah
tax dollars will go, for example.
yeah but okay, and then I'd call into attention the distinction between a 16 and 18-year-old, where the line is just quite a bit more blurred than it would be between a
Yeah,
16 and a 20-year-old.
for
And
sure.
then on top of that, I'd add, look, if even if a 20-year-old is a little bit more informed, or has a job and tries to live independently, they're very much, and we can see this statistically, still not as engaged in politics as 16 and 17-year-olds would be, because they just don't come out to vote. So in that, right, we can keep on going back and forward between, some groups are more qualified to do this, some groups are more qualified to do this, but you're right. It's about the trend and direction of a group, or the trend and direction in society. And we know that suffrage generally increases over time. The amount of people that are brought to a decision-making table increases over time, because uh, the issues and challenges of the day change. But also in that, I'd argue that we let 16 and 17-year-olds sort of leave home or leave school. Like we say they're capable enough to make a decision like that, which is potentially life changing. So there is basis there to say that, look, voting for an elected representative probably less consequential than those decisions on a whole,
Like
right?
I agree with you about 16 and 17-year-olds being more independent, but I think if we're looking at those trends and what we say across society, most 16-year-olds, most 17-year-olds are
Yeah,
at home being
I
looked after by a parent. So,
and
and when I say most, I would say, I don't know these facts and figures. I could probably look up Stats New Zealand and find out it's going to be in the 90th percentile plus. So,
in that I completely agree, right?
yeah,
Like that's a reasonable thing to say. I mean, it's a funny thing, I'm 18 right now, and I have, well, most of my peers are my age, right? So we're all still pretty much living at home, because it's almost impossible to find accommodation elsewhere,
yeah,
right?
yeah.
We're living under our parents' roof. A lot of us started working when we were 16 and 17. Obviously, not a big chunk of 16 and 17-year-olds, uh, or even, most 16 and 17-year-olds would be employed, but some are still working. So that's the thing, right? The direction we have to take as a campaign is, let's separate this idea that somehow an age basis for voting is the single qualifying factor,
Mm.
because the qualifying factors go a little bit deeper than what we generally legislate for on the surface.
Look, I think, can I be honest? I think you've got that wrong. And look, I hope you're taking this conversation as a bouncing around of ideas,
Yeah,
because
for
it's
sure.
I'm not against this, but I think you've got that wrong, because the
Okay,
only qualifying factor is age. That's the only
that's
qualifying actor, and but that's the only qualifying factor there can be, whether it's 16 or 18. That's the
yeah,
only qualifying factor it can be, because any other qualifying factor would then rule out people of different ages as well. Like if it was a knowledge based or whatever, then the 20-year-old who doesn't know what they're doing wouldn't be able to vote. So I actually think that both in practice and in reality, the only qualifying factor can be age. The question is, should that be 16?
yeah, and that's exactly what we're saying, right? Like, we with a basically, my thinking is that 18 is outworn, right? We did it in 1974 or sometime in the 1970s. We moved it down to 18. because we had the Vietnam War, we had widespread student protests. It was globally what was happening as well. Like that was just a global democratic trend. And in that, we said that the age uh, should be changed because this age group is very much clearly, you know, capable, not only capable of making those decisions, but is affected by the decisions.
Yeah, for
I'd also
sure.
add there's an interesting thing we read as like something that's been tossed around inside the campaign. I think there was a Royal Commission report in sometime either like late 1980s or early 1990s. I don't have the date on me, and it was about MMP and all of these new electoral rules that we're introducing, and a question was there about the voting age. And back then they were like, look, reasonably we can make an argument that 16 and 17-year-olds would be able to make these decisions anyway. So back then I think the reason it wasn't made 16 and 17 was because I don't think there was really a need or an outside push to have this
Yeah.
new group come in to make those decisions, and B, because one, you pointed this out, we probably legislated for 18 to be the age for most things,
Yeah.
um, or the minimum
Yeah.
age, and that changed over time. So, like I say for country, like I look at a global context as well. For countries that have already lowered the voting age, there hasn't really been a change in the way they treat young people in, let's say, the youth justice system, or the way they treat drinking, right? Or ideas like that.
No, but I agree with you. I guess what I'm saying is, like, it would seem to be, and I'm not even talking about me necessarily, but it would seem to be an easier sell for people if there was consistency in the age discrimination. Because
Mm.
at the moment, there's lots of different ones, but understandably. Hey, look, answer me this. Where to from here? Because I think that I read in the story that ideally you'd like it in before 2023. I don't know how realistic that is, but I can tell
Yeah.
you what, if it was after that, if I mean, you have to probably argue that National are act on are favourites to win next year at the moment. And if it
Yeah.
was after that, I think your chances are far less in getting it through in the next term than in getting through in the next 12 months. Whereas
Yeah.
a Green Labour coalition will probably get it through. Should it be decided to go through? What's the next steps? Is it going to be in place within 12 months, or where to from here?
Strategically speaking, I would say, look, because of that supermajority provision, that 75% threshold, it's still a really hard, it's still an uphill battle, right? But for local elections, on the other hand, we only need
Yeah.
51% of parliament. And the Future of Local Government report has already come out and said, look, you should lower it for 16 and 17. So I think it's very reasonable to maybe say for local elections, they do get lowered sometime before the next election. And by 2026, we can see it being lowered for all elections. But this is happening globally, right? This is a trend. We're very much riding a global advocacy wave, because a lot of European nations have started lowering the voting age for European parliamentary elections, and there are just emerging movements in Western democracies very similar to ours. A lot of counties in the U.S. have lowered the voting age to 16. So it's just a part of a larger trend that isn't as large as maybe the voting age for 18 was, but is still emergent and forthcoming. So,
I mean, just on that, not to elongate the conversation anymore. I mean, here's the Wikipedia page of voting ages. It doesn't seem to be much of a trend voting for government. I mean, if you scroll down
there are
there,
200 nations in the world. Like I think when I
yeah,
say trend from a grassroots and advocacy point of view, uh, we're not going to see a lot of change immediately, but it's a
yeah,
trend in that there are emergent movements coming up in a lot of different countries saying they want this change.
yeah,
And for countries like Germany, for example, it's a staged approach. It's a stacked approach where they will lower it for municipalities first, and then they will lower it for European parliamentary elections, and eventually they'll get it for all elections. So that's why I think
yeah.
2026 is a much more reasonable timeline.
Yeah. Yeah, and I guess that's what we were waiting to see. Hey, look, congratulations on the day. I guess for you guys in and of itself, it must be an exciting day to get that Supreme Court ruling. Thanks for joining us today.
No
It's
worries.
been a really interesting conversation, and I do look forward to seeing where it goes from here. The co-director of Make It 16, Sanat Singh. It's been awesome. Thanks, dude.
Brilliant. Thanks so much.